Apple and its signature MacBook Pros have been around for a while. The design and user-friendly interface of the MacBook Pro laptops are iconic, and many customers swear by the ease of use of the Mac operating system. Apple's MacBooks are popular with business people, creative people, and many more. As long as you can afford it, the MacBook is a laptop that anyone can use. Before, the MacBook Pro was powered by Intel CPUs. Performance was great for the many generations of Intel MacBook Pros since they were launched in 2006. But now the tables have turned. This 2021, the latest generation of MacBook Pros now have Apple's very own M1 chipset. M1 is not made by Intel. Rather, it's Apple's own CPU and more. Now the big questions are, what's inside the M1 and what makes it better than Intel CPUs? Apple Silicon. The M1 chipset is a kind of Apple Silicon, so named because Apple themselves manufacture the chips. For comparison, the i3, i5, and i7 processors of old MacBook Pros are all made by Intel, a company that's famous for making CPUs for desktops and laptops. But the M1, the entire thing is Apple made. What's the advantage? Well, think of it like the iPhone and iPad. In these devices, the chips inside are also Apple-made. These chips have gone through several generations of improvements, from the A4 of the iPhone 4 to the A14 Bionic chip of the latest iPhone 12. iPads have also used a similar A-series chipset. With these Apple-designed chips, you can be sure that iPhone and iPad hardware are fully compatible with the iOS. No hiccups, no frequent error screens or any of that. Just reliable, solid performance. In these devices, Apple has designed both the hardware and the software so they both work together without a hitch. The same principle applies with the latest generation of MacBook Pros. With the M1 chipset, there would be fewer internal parts manufactured by third parties. That means that Apple can make the hardware integrate with the software a lot better since both are Apple-made. What you get is a much better performance of the laptops overall. System on a chip. Here's another unique thing about Apple's M1. It's not just a CPU, it's a system on a chip. In other words, the M1 integrates the CPU, graphics processor, memory controller, USB controllers, audio processor, and many others into just one chip. So what does that mean? For the most part, a chip that integrates many components into one results in a device that runs on less power. In other words, the M1 MacBook Pros would have much longer battery life. According to Apple, the M1 chips run on just 1/4 the power while delivering the same performance as the latest laptop chips. They didn't specifically say what those latest laptop chips are though, but if this is true, then you're looking at a MacBook Pro that will run a lot longer while unplugged. Another advantage is the M1 chipset would allow Apple to design MacBooks with much smaller motherboards. If lots of individual components could be crammed into one small chip, then there would be more space for other parts like the battery. Imagine having an energy-efficient MacBook Pro with a larger battery. You could have a laptop with guaranteed whole-day battery life. No need to plug in every few hours. With this, you might not even need to charge your laptop while you're going away from home. The M1 chipset doesn't skimp on performance either. Apple claims it can deliver twice the CPU and graphics performance of the latest laptop chip, again, whatever those latest laptop chips are. Unified memory architecture. Another key feature of the M1 MacBook Pros is what Apple calls a unified memory architecture. In other words, the RAM can be accessed by any part of the chipset if needed. This means that any part of the system, like the GPU, the neural engine, and others, can borrow memory instantly. There's no slowdown, unlike in traditional computer setups. Why? Because even the RAM is integrated into the M1 chip. There are no separate RAM modules in slots or RAM chips soldered onto the logic board. Everything is on the M1 chip. For this reason, even memory performance is a lot faster and more efficient. But some people might complain that they can't add more RAM to the M1 MacBooks. While this might be a problem for power users and those who run a ton of apps all at the same time, it's not an issue for everyday users. You could even have a lot of Chrome tabs open and still run video editing software like Adobe Premiere or Final Cut. If you use the laptop for just web browsing and document editing, it shouldn't be a problem. Speaking of RAM, the M1 MacBook Pros come with either 8 gigs or 16 gigs of RAM. Not a lot for professional standards, but more than enough for most users. And with the unified memory architecture, running out of memory should not be an issue. Still compatible with the usual apps. Some users are concerned with app compatibility on the M1 MacBooks. Since they don't use Intel processors, and many Mac apps are coded to work with Intel processors, they may not work well with the M1. This is a really valid concern. Fortunately, this isn't a problem. Most apps do work well with the M1 chipset. Apple has devised a piece of software called Rosetta 2 to take care of the compatibility issues. In simple terms, Rosetta 2 translates the code of apps coded for Intel processors so that code can be understood by the M1 chipset. That way, most apps would work just as they would in older MacBook Pros. In addition, you can even run iPad apps on the M1 MacBooks. The M1 chipset is designed in a similar way to the iPad and iPhone A series chipsets, where almost every essential component is on a single chip. With that, iPad apps can run smoothly on M1 MacBooks as well. But without a touchscreen, navigating those apps is a huge challenge. Apple does offer a set of touch alternatives, but they're still awkward to use. Running iPad apps on the M1 MacBook Pro is not as smooth as it is on the iPad. Then again, not a lot of people would probably use iPad apps on a device that doesn't have a touchscreen. Accessories and peripherals still work. If you have a collection of dongles, docks, and devices that connect to the MacBook's USB-C and Thunderbolt ports, they would still work with the M1 MacBooks. The ports are the same, so compatibility is not an issue. As for wireless devices, the M1 MacBooks still have Bluetooth connectivity, so your typical wireless headphones, wireless keyboard, and wireless mouse would still work well. What happened to Intel MacBooks? Apple still sells MacBooks with Intel processors, but they're only available until stocks run out. Apple is slowly transitioning to M1-powered MacBooks, including the Air, Pro, and Mac Mini lines. In a matter of 2 years, they will no longer make new MacBooks with Intel processors. There are still some Intel-powered MacBook Pros available today, though. These are the more expensive models, which are preferred by power users and professionals who do processor-intensive work. Eventually, Apple's plan is to phase out Intel processors altogether. In the 2-year transition period, the M1 chipset is just the beginning. Apple will continue to develop its own chipsets for all Macs. Later on, every Mac will have Apple Silicon in them. The move to make all Apple computers use Apple-designed chipsets is a bold move for Apple, but this is a company that always dares to make those bold moves. Apple has done this before, ditching the CD drive in the first MacBook Air, removing the MagSafe connector with the 2018 MacBooks, and taking out the headphone jack in the iPhone 7. This time, with the M1 MacBooks, they're ditching the processor and replacing it with their own chip. But with this development, it's not a bad thing. Performance-wise, reviews have shown that the M1 chipset is a force to be reckoned with. It beats the capabilities of Intel CPUs and it's energy efficient. Because of this, the M1 might just spark another revolution in computer technology. Pretty soon, you may see laptops with integrated chipsets as something normal. Apple is also known to be a trendsetter, so it would only take a matter of time before other companies follow suit. One thing is certain though, these M1 MacBook Pros, as well as those that come after it, will sell well and make a lot of users happy.